Today I want to introduce you to consent theory. Consent does make a difference. In fact, it's widely agreed that personal consent makes actions on the part of others towards you or towards rights that you have permissible, actions that would otherwise not be permissible, right? So consent is the difference between borrowing and stealing, squatting and renting, sex and rape, photography and stalking, a non-disclosure agreement and censorship, right? In all these cases, we describe actions that are quite similar in very different moral terms, based on whether or not consent has occurred. Now, similarly, when the government coerces you, it might be justified in doing so by virtue of the fact that you agreed to subject yourself to its rule and authority. I think on the surface, the strategy sounds promising, and I think most people, when it comes down to it, have some kind of consent theory of government as the rationale for why they should obey the governments that they live under. All this being said, people really disagree about the details of consent theory, right? When is a sign of consent binding to the person given that sign? When is it okay to assume that people have given their consent? When is it permissible to ignore non-consent, right? These are all areas perhaps on the edges of consent theory that need to be fully fleshed out, and about which people, I think, can reasonably disagree. Now, there are four major ways in the history of political thought in which people have thought that consent theory might work. Explicit consent, tacit consent, implied consent, and hypothetical consent. And so the rest of this lecture is going to be exploring all four. Now, explicit consent is the clearest and most obvious kind of consent. It requires verbal or written assent to a clear list of conditions. So someone presents you with a list of terms and conditions, and you say yes or no. However, it's certainly possible that signs of consent, saying yes, nodding your head, signing your name, things that look like consent, so signs of consent, might not always bind the person consenting. That is to say, even when you nod your head, even when you say yes, even when you sign your name, it might not be the case that you are consenting. I think most of us can think of examples. For example, if someone has a gun to your head or threatens your loved ones, right? In those cases, the fact that you said yes or vigorously nodded your head to their demands doesn't seem like consent. You said yes, you signed on a dotted line, but that signature and that sign of consent are ultimately non-voluntary, right? They're coerced out of you. They're not of your will. Right, so it sounds like consent has to be voluntary, but not all signs of consent are voluntarily produced. It's also true that your faculties might be impaired. So no one's got a gun to your head, but you might be drunk or high or otherwise mentally incapacitated. Giving a sign of consent without being capable of understanding the consequences of what you're doing doesn't seem to bind you in the same way as when you do understand the consequences of what you're doing. And when you're capable of accepting the consequences. Because there might be times when you're just simply not able to accept the consequences. You might be dimly aware that you're consenting to something, but you're unable to process what it is that you're in fact doing. Also, signs of consent can be a misunderstanding. Consent involves knowingly accepting the consequences. You have to be able to understand the consequences. If someone tricks you, or if there's an honest misunderstanding, it's possible that you haven't consented to anything. Once again, if the terms weren't what you thought they were, it's possible that you didn't actually consent to them, or you consented to something else. Now, there is a distinct question, and I think people sometimes resist this and say, well, it's up to you to figure out what the terms that you're agreeing to are. They take a hard line on consent, and I think that's possible, but I want to distinguish two questions here, right? One, whether or not you voluntarily agreed, understanding the consequences, so whether you consented, and on the other hand, whether it's permissible for others to act as though you have consented, right? There might be times when others are permitted to assume that you've consented even when you didn't, right? That's a separate case. It doesn't mean you consented, but maybe they can be authorized to act as though you did if they, in good faith, believe that you have. Okay, so let's think about our government for a second. Have American citizens usually explicitly agreed to be governed by the American state? Have they been presented with a list of terms that said, yes, I accept this law code and acknowledge all rights and obligations that come with it? Well, what do you think? I think some probably have. If you're a naturalized citizen, you often have to swear an oath to the Constitution, and you have to agree to abide by all lawful commands. Um, and certainly a lot of people might want to consent. Uh, but it's not clear to me that most citizens have actually consented to being governed by any state, most citizens in the world, let alone the United States. That is to say, no one's presented them with a list of terms, and they never said yes or signed any document. Most citizens, our experience of government is that we grow up obeying laws without thinking too much about whether the government has a right to legislate and coerce. Government is there, it's like the weather, death and taxes, right? Things that are going to happen no matter what we do. And so we don't think about it too much. And maybe we would consent if we were asked. America's a great place to live, but we weren't asked. And sometimes that makes all the difference, right? Okay, so if most people haven't actually said yes or signed on the dotted line, maybe their silence counts as consent. Tacit consent just means silent consent. Sometimes I think it's obvious that silence can count as consent, but equally obviously, silence doesn't always count as consent. So we have to ask ourselves, when can silence be binding on an agent, and will that strategy be promising for justifying government? One example, and this comes out of John Simmons, if a CEO says to the board of directors, we will meet next Tuesday at 8 p.m. rather than our usual time, any objections? And then pauses. And nobody objects. Well, it sounds like they've tacitly consented here. It sounds like silence, not raising an objection, is equivalent to consent. Not saying something binds you. But of course this is tricky, because silence can mean a lot of things. One person could have been tying their shoes and not paying attention. Another person could have been asleep, but looked like they were awake. Their silence at that point doesn't indicate that they've consented. It just means that they weren't aware of what was going on. So we have to be careful with silence. John Simmons gives a nice framework to think about these sorts of situations. When can silence be taken as a sign of consent? Well, he comes up with at least 6 conditions, and I think they're pretty good. I think we could quibble about some of them, but overall, I think they're quite reasonable. Right? First, individuals must be aware that this is a consent situation. So if some of the people on the board are sleeping, silence doesn't mean they consented. Silence means that they just weren't aware that there was a consent situation in play. There also has to be some understood period of time where expressions of non-consent can be registered. If nobody says anything, but then 30 minutes after the meeting someone raises an objection, well, it just doesn't sound like non-consent then. Non-consent is applicable. So there has to be some understood period of time where expressions of non-consent can be registered. Because if you say any objections and then you just don't give anybody any time to think about it, then it doesn't seem like their silence is consent. It just seems that silence means I'm thinking about it, or I just didn't have time to formulate an objection. Third, the point at which non-consent no longer counts must be clear. If you don't know, is it an open-ended question, or is there some period of time when you have to register your disapproval? Again, if not, then silence may not be consent. 4, and I think more interestingly, the means acceptable for signaling non-consent must be reasonable and easily performed. If I say anybody disagrees, please show your non-consent by performing a backflip, then not performing a backflip doesn't mean you consented. It just means I can't perform a backflip. And so for that reason, your silence and your failure to, in this case, perform a backflip doesn't mean that you consented. It means something quite different. 5, the consequences of non-consent can't be too extremely detrimental to the one who refuses his or her consent. Now this is more controversial, right? But like if non-consent means you're going to be persecuted by somebody, it doesn't sound like your non-consent. I'm sorry, it doesn't sound like your consent really is voluntary. It just means I want to avoid an extremely bad consequence. So, as with number 4, silence may just be an inability to refuse. And finally, number 6, it has to be the case that non-consent makes a difference, right? I think this one's really important, right? Silence, people will remain silent often if they feel like it doesn't matter what they say, right? If it doesn't matter whether I say yes or no, then why should I speak up? And I think that's a really important point to make, is that sometimes silence just means I don't think this matters, and so I'm not going to raise my voice. So in other words, silence might be acceptance of the inevitable. Okay. Now, tacit consent seems really demanding. You've got these 6 conditions, right? And if you want to ground political obligations, we have to ask the question, are people generally aware that they have the option to not consent to American government? Are the means of signaling non-consent easy to perform? What would it mean not to consent? Are the consequences of non-consent extremely detrimental for you? And finally, and I think this is perhaps the decisive argument, will non-consent be efficacious? Will it matter? If I say no, I don't recognize your right to rule. If I say to the federal government, no, I am an independent sovereign citizen, I don't want to pay my taxes, I don't want any government benefits, will that matter? And of course, I think it's very clearly, and there's a number of course cases that back me up here, very clearly, no, it won't matter. And so in that case, tacit consent just doesn't seem to be a good strategy, because it sounds like being silent can mean many, many, many things. And most likely it means an awareness that the political order will be imposed upon one, regardless of whether we consent or not. Okay. So most of us haven't explicitly consented, and most of the time our silence is ambiguous. So maybe it's our behavior that indicates consent. And this strategy is called implied consent. Rather confusingly, Locke calls implied consent tacit consent. But if you read John Locke's Treatise of Government, you'll see that he refers to tacit consent. But what he really means is implied consent. Today we would call that implied consent. Here's what implied consent is. Implied consent can be an act that may lead us to conclude that a person would have consented had they been asked. So you do something that makes people think that they would consent if you'd asked them. 2, an act or statement may in fact be logically commit you to consenting. It would be irrational or stupid to say something and then refuse to consent. And finally, an act may be such that it binds us just like consent. It would be wrong not to consent given the act that you committed or given the behavior that you exhibited. So if you go around waving American flags and say, America's the greatest country on earth, I love America, and someone comes along and says, do you consent to the government? And you say no, well, it sounds like you're being irrational, right? It sounds like, given everything that you've said, you have in fact implicitly consented, even though you never said yes, right? So we might think that certain kinds of behaviors, again, strongly imply that someone would consent, and in fact it might be wrong or simply irrational for them to then refuse consent when asked. This kind of implied consent, I think, helps explain really well why foreigners are consenting to the laws of the land when they travel, even if they never sign a form explicitly upon entering the country saying, I will respect all laws, as I travel through this country. The act of crossing a border just implicitly, in an implied way, comes with certain stipulations, voluntariness, awareness. So as long as you cross the border voluntarily and are aware that you're crossing a border, it seems like crossing the border doesn't just bind like consent, it is consent. You crossed a border that itself says to the world, I am going to agree or I'm going to abide by the laws of the country that I'm going into. It just seems like it would be irrational or wrong to travel to somebody's country and to then turn around and say, no, I didn't agree to obey these laws. What are you talking about? Right? Okay. 2 arguments for tacit consent worth thinking about, 2 popular arguments. I'm going to come back to them in a later video, so I'm not going to say much about them here. But residence and voting, most people think that either choosing to continue residing in a country or choosing to participate in a country's institutions counts as consenting to be governed. If you reside and you participate in the political institutions, then those are acts that seem to imply, on most people's accounts, that you have consented to the rule of that government. I think this is probably the leading forward of consent theory today. As long as you're free to leave, and as long as the consequences of staying are well understood and capable of being understood by everyone, then implied consent seems like quite a promising strategy. But like I said, more on that in a separate video. Residence and voting on the surface look like they might be good indicators of consent to government. For now, it's worth noting that all 3 versions of consent theory that we've considered so far are problematic with respect to at least some categories of citizens, in particular children and others who are unable to consent, and that actions like silence, of course, can be ambiguous. We've already said that. So if tacit consent doesn't work, I'm going to offer one last possible strategy for consent theory to still be a strategy for for justifying political authority. Hypothetical consent. Hypothetical consent is when rational and reasonable people would consent to permit an arrangement, right? If it would be irrational for you to refuse, or if it's simply wrong of you to refuse the terms of a contract, then maybe you're obligated by its terms, even in the absence of explicit, tacit, or even implied personal consent on your part. So how might this work? Well, I want to give you an example. Imagine that a man is involved in a car accident and is knocked out. The EMTs arrive on the scene to help, and the man involved in the accident, who's knocked out, is clearly unable to consent to CPR, surgery, even being moved out of his car, right? Ordinarily, no one can be touched, moved, or operated upon, certainly not cut into in a surgical fashion, without their explicit written consent, or at least verbal consent, right? That's just normal, right? So how can we justify the behavior of medical personnel who go to great lengths to save a person in that sort of situation? Well, we might justify that behavior by saying the medical personnel have to imagine what the person would want in that situation. And since all, or at least most rational and reasonable people would want to have their lives saved, then they can go ahead and do what they need to do to save the life, because they can assume that that person would have consented to it if they'd been awake and able to. Now, unlike other types of consent, hypothetical consent can deal really well with the government's right to rule over those who cannot consent. The children and the deeply disabled, right, are not thought to be able to consent to government, but as long as we can imagine that a rational and reasonable person, that those people would be, if they were in their right mind, would consent to things like compulsory schooling or saving people who wish to commit suicide, even though they clearly are trying to jump off a bridge, we can justify keeping kids in school and preventing people from jumping off bridges because we might imagine what those individuals would want if they were in their right mind, if they were capable of consenting, right? For children, it's by reason of being too young. For those who are suicidal, it might be for other psychological reasons, but we might think that in both cases, a rational and reasonable person would not do those, would consent, right, to the kinds of actions or coercive actions that the government undertakes to take on their behalf. Okay. Of course, it's worth noting most people are not children or of unsound mind. When normal adults say no to government, may the government then just assume that these people are of unsound mind and coerce them anyway? What kind of crazy person wouldn't consent to the rule of the American federal government, after all? Well, good question. There's also a sense in which hypothetical consent seems like no consent at all. And I think this is potentially one of the most troubling part of hypothetical consent theories, is that maybe there aren't consent theories at all. They're just imaginings of what rational and reasonable people would want, but is that just substituting the judgment of the person doing the imagining for the judgment of the person who actually is bound by this hypothetical authority that we are trying to impose on them? After all, if you look in history, history is littered with examples where some people are empowered to consent on behalf of others, and we're highly suspicious of those arrangements. When husbands were allowed to consent on behalf of their wives, or masters on behalf of their apprentices, we recognize that this created situations where people's rights were not very well protected. And so we recognize that substituting the judgment of what some people think is rational and reasonable for the judgment of others is potentially a very dangerous game to be playing. So we might ultimately reserve hypothetical consent strategies for situations where people really truly are unable to consent for various reasons. When they can consent, we really should listen to what they actually have to say. However, and I'll leave you with this. One interesting question is whether the power difference between a state and a citizen automatically shouldn't make us a little bit suspicious of whether consent to government can be voluntary or not, right? Think about it for a second. We generally are suspicious of contracts between, say, employers and employees, or even we're very suspicious of people within the same company going out on dates with one another and being able to consent to relationships with one another, because we're worried about the power differentials that some positions give over other people within that organization. And if that's the case, then we should really be suspicious of the kinds of consent one might give to a very powerful organization like the government. So even then, the hypothetical consent theorists might come back and just say, look, no one's really able to consent to government. So we have to imagine what rational and reasonable people would want, because people's actual consent is likely to be tinged with the fear that they have of displeasing a very, very powerful entity. Okay. This video's gone on a while, so it's time to conclude. So we've examined 4 possible strategies for authorizing government through consent. Explicit consent might work. It sounds like it should work, but it doesn't seem like most people have ever explicitly consented to government. Tacit consent seems a little bit too ambiguous because it's never clear what silence means. Implied consent is promising and probably worth investigating more. More on that later. And finally, hypothetical consent seems to be quite reasonable when individuals really are unable to consent for themselves, but it raises really uncomfortable questions about how much anyone can consent for themselves when they bargain with very powerful entities.